Jesus Christ is Lord. We're presuming to usurp his authority and to dictate what Christ wants. We live to Christ, and we have to allow other people to live to Christ as well. So, first thing, relationships in the church are right only when we live to the Lord and we allow other people to live to the Lord. Second thing, relationships at work are right only when we live to Christ. Colossians 3:22 to 4:1. John's about to get there. He really is. I have to say that because he spent 2 weeks on this last lesson. He's still got another week to go. He really is going to get there, folks. Okay. Slaves, obey your earthly masters in every respect, not only when they're watching, like those who are strictly people pleasers, but with a sincere heart, fearing the Lord. Whatever you're doing, work at it with enthusiasm as to the Lord and not for people, because you know that you will receive your inheritance from the Lord as the reward. Serve the Lord Christ, for the one who does wrong will be repaid for his wrong, and there are no exceptions. Masters, treat your slaves with justice and fairness, because you know that you also have a master in heaven. I've mentioned before that when we get to Ephesians chapter 5, I notice that preachers generally start with the passage where it says, wives, be submissive to your husbands. Right? All you got to do is back up one verse where it says, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. But we don't start there. We start with, wives, submit to your husbands, right? We kind of do the same thing here. If you notice, there's a chapter change between slaves and masters. Why do you suppose that is? Isn't that a part of the same context? It doesn't matter which side of the work relationship you're on. Now, the first thing I need to say is that the text does not justify slavery. Last week, after we talked about the expression for Christ, an African-American brother met me at the back door. I mentioned he's African-American because I think that will help you understand why I appreciated this comment so much. He said, we live in a day when people are just so reactive to everything, they don't realize it was the principles that Jesus gave that eliminated slavery. Now, it took centuries to do it, but that's what did it. Because Jesus comes along and says, treat each other fairly, and fairness ultimately won the day. But the principles in this text are equally applicable to modern relationships between employers and employees as they were in the first century to the relationship between slaves and masters. One of the things this brother told me last week was he noticed that in the first century, the Christian writers and the Christian community as a whole were not advocating social upheaval. They accepted the world in which they lived and said, here's how we live in the world in which we find ourselves. And that was true of men and women. It was true of slaves and masters. It was true of every situation. So that Paul would say, wherever you find yourself, when you're called, remain in that state and serve the Lord. He wasn't approving the institution. He just said, this is where we live. And as long as this is where we live, this is how we ought to conduct ourselves. Fairness, though, it ultimately eliminated the whole institution. But the principles of behavior in the text are equally applicable to relationships between employers and employees, aren't they? I mean, look at the text. Whatever you're doing, work at it with enthusiasm as to the Lord and not for people, because you know that you will receive your inheritance from the Lord as the reward. Serve the Lord Christ. What's he saying? Work hard. There are two relationships here. If you're working for someone else, whether in the first century as a slave or in the 21st century as an employee, the principle is you live to another master. You're responsible to someone besides your employer. Verse 22. Slaves, obey your earthly masters in every respect, not only when they're watching like those who are strictly people pleasers, but with a sincere heart, fearing the Lord. The other side of that relationship, whether in the first century you were a master or whether in the 21st century you're an employer, is you have a master too. Masters, treat your slaves with justice and fairness because you know that you also have a master in heaven. Living to Christ transforms our relationships at work in a way that nothing else can. We need to learn to see Jesus at work. Maybe we don't live in a world where we can talk about him that much at work. But people still need to see him in us at work. And we need to see ourselves as working not just for the people that we work for. The question was asked in class this morning, how many of you work for someone else? And how many of you are bosses, okay? Well, I guess I could raise my hand to both of those, you know. I'm responsible to the people that come before me to give them fairness in the way that I treat them. We have to see Jesus in our work, and that transforms the relationship. It means that if you're working for someone else, you have a Christian work ethic. What does that mean? It means you don't come late and leave early. It means you don't pilfer supplies. It means you don't pad your expense account. It means a lot of things. It means that you're completely honest so that when people think of you, they can take your word as your bond. Years ago when I was practicing law, I got one of those compliments. Have you ever gotten one of those compliments from somebody that didn't come to you directly? It came roundabout from someone else. Have you ever gotten one of those? Those mean more than anything else, don't you think? A judge told another lawyer, and it got back to me. If Dale Wells tells you something, you can count on it. Wow. That's something we all want people to think about when they think about us. Christian work ethic, it's critical for us to model Christ in the workplace. But it's also critical for us to model Christ if we are in a position of responsibility over others, to treat them fairly, and to be right with the way we handle them. You may remember the name of John Newton. John Newton wrote several hymns that we sing. The one we're most familiar with is Amazing Grace. Now, what you may not realize, or you may have heard the story before, John Newton grew up as the son of a slave trader. And he grew up working the ships with his father, the slave trader. His mother was a Christian, his father was not. And during a particularly horrendous storm, John Newton had a kind of a moment where he decided that he'd better make some adjustments in his life, and he did. He converted to Christ. He went to school, became a minister, preached until he died in his 80s. When he couldn't even see his manuscript, he'd have a little boy stand up here with him as he preached, and the little boy would move the manuscript for him so he could stay with where he was in his sermon. Big letters. Kind of like, have you ever watched somebody play piano or organ or something like that in a concert, and they have somebody sitting beside them to, turn the pages for them? That's kind of what he was doing, okay? And he just wouldn't give up preaching. John Newton said in one of his sermons this: "If I were a shoe shine boy, I'd be the best in town because I'd shine every pair of shoes as though Jesus would be wearing them." There was a fellow named Samuel Chadwick, who centuries later heard a preacher quote John Newton, the quotation I just read to you. Now, Samuel Chadwick was the son of a laborer, and his job every night was to shine his dad's shoes. And his dad came home with muddy, filthy shoes. And he'd start with the worst shoes first to get the worst job out of the way. And after he'd done the first pair of shoes, he set them aside, and then he remembered that quotation of John Newton. I'd look at every pair of shoes as though Jesus was going to wear them. And he asked himself, would these shoes look good on Jesus' feet? And guess what he did? Did them again. Later on, he said this, it was the most important thing I ever did. I got into the habit of doing even the simplest duties as to Christ. So folks, Christ's followers should be the very best employees. Christ's followers should be the very best employers. Relationships in the church are right only when we live to Christ. Relationships at work are right only when we live to Christ. Relationships in the world are right only when we live to Christ. There's a great text. It's called the parable of the sheep and goats. Rather lengthy, in Matthew chapter 25. When the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, then he will sit on his glorious throne. Before him will be gathered all the nations, and he will separate people from one another as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And he will place the sheep on his right, but the goats on his left. Then the king will say to those on his right, come, you who are blessed by my Father. Inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, and you came to me. Then the righteous will answer him, saying, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you drink? And when did we see you a stranger and welcome you, or naked and clothe you? And when did we see you sick or in prison and visit you? And the king will answer them, truly I say to you, as you did it to one of the least of these my brothers, you did it to me. Most of our translations say, as you did it for one of the least of these my brothers, you did it for me. Keep that in mind for a second. Then he will say to those on his left, depart from me, you who are cursed, into the eternal fire, prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you gave me no food. I was thirsty, and you gave me no drink. I was a stranger, and you did not welcome me. Naked, and you did not clothe me. Sick and in prison, and you did not visit me. Then they also will answer, saying, Lord, when did we see you hungry or thirsty or a stranger or naked or sick or in prison, and did not minister to you? Then he will answer them, saying, truly I say to you, as you did not do it to one of the least of these, you did not do it to me. And these will go away into eternal punishment, but the righteous into eternal life. Now, why did I mention that difference between 2 and 4? Not just because we're talking about a lesson called To Christ. There's another reason. Have you ever noticed that sometimes you can do something to one person for someone else? Have you ever noticed that? You've heard that expression, pay it forward, right? Pay it forward. Where you do something nice for someone, and then they go out and do something nice for someone else, right? What Jesus is saying is not just, if you do something nice for this person, you're doing it on my behalf. That's not what he's saying. He's not saying you're doing it for me, okay? What he's saying is, what you do to them, you do to me. What you do not do to them, you do not do to me. See how that puts a little different perspective on it? Now, the text says there's going to come a day when the Lord's going to return, and he's going to separate between the righteous and the unrighteous. And there's that judgment scene. But notice, the focus of the text is not on the judge. The focus of the text is not on the people who are being judged, the righteous and the unrighteous. The focus of the text is not even on the judgment. The focus of the text is not on the individuals being judged. It's on the evidence produced against them or for them. I guess that's one of the pitfalls of my profession. I'm always looking for evidence type stuff, okay? It's on the evidence produced in court as the basis for the judgment. Why is this person a sheep? I should go this way. And this person a goat. Did you realize that? Those on the right are sheep, those on the left are goats. Did you realize that? Sorry, folks. It's on the evidence. And what is the evidence? The evidence is not what was your position on, pick an issue. Instrumental music, women in the church, baptism, Lord's Supper, pick an issue. Buildings, fellowship halls, whatever it might be, paid ministers. It's not on whether you dotted the I's and crossed the T's just correctly. I love dotted I's and crossed T's. I really do. I mean, I'm one of that's the way my mind works, okay? But that's not the basis for the judgment. That's not the evidence, is it? What's the evidence? The evidence is, how did you treat the down and out? What did you do for them? Or what did you not do for them? What did you do to them? Or what did you not do to them? Because Jesus says, whatever you did to them, you did to me. And whatever you did not do to them, you did not do to me. In other words, the folks on one side, I helped. The folks on the other side, whatever. Love is something you do. That's something I've pointed out many times. And we talked about the word for love in the New Testament. There are 4 words for love in the Greek world. The one that's used most often in the New Testament was hardly ever used elsewhere. There was the word for sexual love, eros. We get our word erotic from it. There was the word storge, which has to do with family love. Blood is thicker than water. There was the word philia that has to do with loving people who enjoy the same things you do. We like the same stuff, so we love each other. That's affiliation type of love. But then there was that word, agape. The other words for love all have to do with something in you that's attractive to me. It could be you turn me on, or it could be, you're related to me, so you can't be all bad, or it could be, we enjoy doing the same stuff together. The word for love in the New Testament, agape, is a word that has nothing to do with any quality in you that's redeemable, or me. It is love because God chose to love. It's love because Christ chose to love. It's love because we choose to love. Love is something you do, Matthew 25 says. Now, I don't know about you guys. When I talk about relationships in the church, I don't feel terribly bad. When I talk about relationships in the world, at work, I don't feel terribly bad. When I talk about relationships in the world, I wonder, how does the way that I treat people in need in the world translate into which side of the judgment I find myself on? You see, a right relationship to Christ leads to right relationships with others. Living to Christ transforms every relationship. In the church family, it means we don't reject each other, we respect each other. Other Christians are not responsible to me, they're responsible to Christ. I'm not responsible to you, I'm responsible to Christ. At work, it means if I'm working, I'm going to be conscientious. And if I'm an employer, I'm going to be fair. It means in the world, we seek to serve the needy. Because in serving them, we serve Him. In other words, to Christ says Christianity is not a religion, it's a relationship. Relationship to Christ affects our relationship to one another in the church. It affects our relationship to people at work. It affects our relationship to the needy in the world. Our goal is that we need to learn to see Jesus in every relationship, not restrict him to Bibles and buildings and business, but to see him in every moment of our lives and live to Christ. The question that should be in our minds all day, every day is, what would Jesus do? What would Jesus have me to do? And then do it. Pray with me. Father,